Tonight I'll guide you through a story, a place where mystery and imagination meet. There's nothing for you to do, nothing to fear. Just listen and let the tale unfold. Let's begin. The Hollow House on Blackwood Lane, nestled deep within the secluded town of Ravensfield. Blackwood Lane was infamous for its dense fog, eerie silence, and one particular house, the Hollow House. Standing at the end of a narrow gravel road, its rotting wooden frame leaned as if under the weight of centuries of secrets. Its gabled roof, shrouded in creeping ivy, gave it the appearance of a predator lurking in the woods. For decades, no one dared step foot inside the Hollow House, not since the night the Wexley family vanished without a trace. Whispers swirled through Ravensfield, stories of guttural voices in the walls, shadows that moved on their own, and an attic that glowed with an unholy crimson light. Then came the Alderson family. Cassie, her husband Tom, and their twin daughters, Lyra and Isla. Newly arrived from the city, they were eager for a fresh start. The Hollow House, with its sprawling garden and surprisingly low price, seemed perfect. Tom dismissed the town's superstitions as backwater gossip. Houses don't get haunted, he laughed. The first night, it began subtly. Cassie was unpacking when she felt the air grow dense, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Lyra and Isla ran to her, wide-eyed. "There's a lady in the attic," Lyra whispered. "Nonsense," Cassie replied, forcing a smile. But when night fell, a rhythmic tapping echoed from above their bedroom. "Rats," Tom muttered, grabbing a flashlight. But in the attic, there were no rats, only a child's rocking chair swaying gently, as if someone invisible had just stood up. The warnings. The next day, Cassie met Mrs. Harlow, the town's librarian. When Cassie mentioned their new home, Mrs. Harlow went pale. "That house, it doesn't let go," she said. "The Wexleys, they left behind something dark." That evening, as Cassie cooked dinner, she saw it, a face in the kitchen window, gaunt and hollow-eyed, staring at her. She screamed, but when Tom ran in, the figure was gone. The descent. The following week spiraled into a waking nightmare. The twins began sleepwalking, murmuring in unison, "She's coming for us." Doors slammed on their own. A rancid smell seeped from the walls, impossible to trace. One night, Tom set up cameras throughout the house. The footage revealed Lyra and Isla standing by the attic door at 3:15 a.m., their eyes vacant. Behind them, a shadow too large to be human shifted, its outline sharp and jagged. When Tom replayed the footage, a single phrase whispered through the speakers, "Get out." The ritual room. Driven by desperation, Cassie and Tom pried open a locked cellar door. Beneath the house, they found a chamber carved from stone, its walls etched with symbols that seemed to pulse. At the center stood an altar blackened with ash. Mrs. Harlow identified the symbols as ancient sigils of summoning. "The Wexleys didn't vanish," she said. "They opened a door to something they couldn't close." The final night. The Aldersons prepared to leave, but the house had other plans. As they packed, a storm erupted, trapping them inside. The power cut out, and the temperature plummeted. At midnight, the attic door creaked open. A chilling wail echoed through the halls, followed by the sound of footsteps. Many footsteps. Shadows spilled from every corner, coalescing into a towering figure with hollow eyes and an endless grin. Clutching their daughters, Cassie and Tom fled. As they reached the front door, it slammed shut, locking them in. Cassie screamed, and Tom turned to see Lyra and Isla being pulled toward the cellar. Desperate, Cassie recited the symbols Mrs. Harlow had given her, though her voice trembled. The shadows shrieked, and the figure writhed as though bound by invisible chains. The Aldersons awoke outside, drenched and trembling. Behind them, the hollow house collapsed inward, as if swallowed by an unseen force. The aftermath. The Aldersons left Ravensfield the next day. They never spoke of the house again. Years later, travelers passing through the woods claimed to hear whispers and see flickering lights where the house once stood. But no one dared build there again. Some places, after all, are better left forgotten. The Eternal Guest. In the remote wilderness of Montana, nestled between towering pines and endless fog, stood the infamous Blackwood Inn. It was an elegant relic from the 1800s, once a luxurious getaway for aristocrats, now abandoned and cloaked in mystery. Rumors whispered of guests who checked in but never checked out, their belongings left untouched as though they had simply vanished. Claire and Ethan, a couple with a penchant for urban exploration, couldn't resist its allure. Armed with flashlights and a single camera, they braved the crumbling roads to document their journey for Claire's growing channel. The inn loomed large in the darkness, its windows like empty eyes, watching. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder, carrying the faint smell of damp wood and something metallic. Claire noticed an odd detail, a golden guest book resting perfectly intact on the reception desk, its pages yellowed with age. The first name scribbled on the top read, Amelia W-1889. "You think people just signed in for fun?" Ethan asked, flipping through. But Claire's eyes were glued to the last entry. Claire S., 2024. Her heart sank. She hadn't written it, but the name, the handwriting. It was unmistakably hers. Brushing off the unease, they pressed on. The camera captured grand chandeliers coated in cobwebs, ornate mirrors cracked like spiderwebs, and tapestries that seemed to ripple as though touched by an unseen hand. Then they heard it. Faint laughter, high-pitched and echoing, as if a group of people were enjoying a hidden party. "Probably just the wind," Ethan muttered, but Claire wasn't convinced. They followed the sound to the ballroom, where the once polished floors were now a mosaic of broken tiles. At the center of the room stood a dining table, lavishly set with rotting food and flickering candles. Around it sat a dozen shadowy figures, their forms translucent, their heads turning in unison as Claire and Ethan stepped closer. One by one, the figures began to vanish, leaving only their chilling whispers. "Join us." Panicked, Claire clutched Ethan's arm, but the room shifted. The walls stretched impossibly high, the chandeliers now glowing with a sinister red hue. The guest book from the front desk lay open on the table, its pages flipping furiously. Ethan, pale and trembling, muttered, "We need to leave." But as they retraced their steps, the inn betrayed them. Hallways that should have led to the exit twisted into endless corridors. Rooms they passed seemed to breathe, their doors opening and slamming shut. A child's voice sang softly behind them. "Stay with me." Claire spun around to find a little girl in a white dress, her face obscured by long, dark hair. The girl extended a hand. "They'll never let you leave," she whispered, her voice echoing. Ethan yanked Claire forward. "Don't listen to her." But the moment he touched Claire, the girl let out an ear-piercing scream, her form dissolving into a flurry of black feathers. The walls began to close in, their ornate patterns writhing like snakes. A deep, guttural growl emanated from somewhere below. As they stumbled into what they thought was the lobby, Ethan collapsed. He gasped for air, clawing at his throat, his skin paling until he became a ghostly outline himself. "Ethan!" Claire screamed, but his body faded, leaving her alone with the oppressive silence. Claire turned to the guest book once more. Beneath her name, in fresh ink, another entry appeared. Ethan R., 2024. The last thing she heard was the creak of a door, the same child's voice singing, and the unmistakable feeling of eyes watching her from every shadow. The Watcher, a story about a pet. Sophie had always been an animal lover. She grew up surrounded by pets, dogs, cats, rabbits. But there was something special about this new one. When she found the stray cat in the alleyway behind her apartment building, it looked at her with such knowing eyes that she couldn't resist bringing it home. The cat, which she named Ash, was jet black, with piercing yellow eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. It wasn't like any cat Sophie had ever seen. Its coat was unusually glossy, almost unnatural, and its movements were eerily smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. But it was friendly enough, curling up next to her when she watched TV, purring softly in her lap. At first, everything seemed fine. Ash settled into the apartment quickly, eating and sleeping as cats tend to do. But then strange things started happening. Sophie would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of faint scratching at her bedroom door. Thinking it was just Ash, she would open the door expecting to find the cat lounging in the hallway. But each time, the hallway would be empty. Ash would be nowhere in sight. One night, Sophie heard the scratching again, but this time it was louder, urgent. Her heart raced as she stood up and walked to the door. She opened it, and there was Ash, sitting silently in the hallway, staring directly at her with those unsettling eyes. Sophie sighed in relief, but as she turned to go back to bed, she felt a chill down her spine. She turned around again, but Ash wasn't there anymore. The hallway was empty. That night, Sophie decided to leave the door cracked open just a little to see if Ash would wander in like usual. As she lay in bed, she heard soft footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and Sophie's heart skipped a beat. But instead of Ash's soft purring, a cold, hollow mew echoed through the apartment. She sat up, her breath catching in her throat. The air felt heavy, and the darkness seemed to close in around her. She tried to call out to Ash, but no sound escaped her lips. The apartment felt suffocating, the walls too close, the air too still. Then she saw it, the yellow eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. Ash was standing at the foot of her bed, but there was something wrong. The cat was much larger now, its fur matted and wild, and the once smooth, graceful movements had become jerky and unnatural. Its body seemed to stretch, elongating as it crept toward her. Sophie's blood ran cold as she realized Ash's eyes were no longer just yellow. They were glowing with an otherworldly, malevolent intensity. Without thinking, Sophie scrambled out of bed and ran to the door, but it slammed shut in front of her. The air grew colder, and a whispering voice, deep and guttural, slithered through the room. "You shouldn't have taken me in," the voice hissed. Sophie turned in horror, and that's when she saw it. A shadowy figure standing behind the cat. It was taller than any person, its limbs long and twisted, its face obscured by darkness, but the eyes, they were the same glowing yellow as Ash's. Sophie screamed and lunged for the window, tearing the curtain down in panic. She didn't care about the fall. She just needed to get out, away from the suffocating presence in her apartment. As she made it out onto the balcony, she turned back, and for a moment, she saw Ash sitting at the window, staring at her with its glowing eyes. But it wasn't just the cat anymore. The shadowy figure stood beside it, staring with an ancient, unblinking gaze that sent Sophie's mind reeling. The creature was watching her. From that night on, Sophie moved out of the apartment. She never spoke of the cat again, but sometimes when she passed the alley where she had found it, she could feel those eyes on her, still watching, still waiting. She didn't know if it was just a hallucination or if the creature had always been there, but she could never shake the feeling that Ash had never been just a cat. And whatever it had become, it wasn't finished with her. The silent hallway. It was an ordinary Tuesday at Graywood High, or so it seemed. Lily had always been the quiet type, sitting in the back of the classroom, keeping to herself. But today felt different. The air in the school seemed thicker, heavier. Something was off. It started when she noticed the hallway on the second floor. It wasn't one she normally passed by. It was tucked away behind the gymnasium, a place most students ignored. Lily had always heard rumors about that hallway. It was said to be the site of strange events, though no one could ever recall exactly what happened there. The school had a way of silencing those stories, brushing them under the rug as if they never existed. But Lily wasn't one to ignore her curiosity. After the final bell rang, signaling the end of classes for the day, Lily stayed behind in the library. She had an odd feeling, a compulsion, to walk down that hallway. The school was empty now save for the janitor, whose footsteps echoed faintly through the hallways. As she made her way toward the door leading to the staircase, she caught a glimpse of the hallway on the second floor. The lights flickered above, casting long shadows. The hallway seemed unnaturally dark, even though it was still early evening. The windows at the end of the corridor were covered with thick, dark curtains, blocking out the fading sunlight. There was a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar, but no sound came from within. Lily's heart beat faster as she climbed the stairs. Her curiosity gnawed at her, and with each step, she felt drawn to that strange door. When she reached the top of the stairs, she hesitated. The hallway was silent, so silent it made her ears ring. She couldn't even hear the usual hum of the overhead lights. But something pulled her forward, and before she knew it, she was standing in front of the door. Her hand trembled as she pushed it open. Inside was a small, abandoned classroom. The walls were covered in old, peeling posters, and the desks were pushed aside, covered in dust. But it wasn't the room itself that sent a chill through her. No, it was the picture on the wall. The old photo showed a group of students, their faces frozen in time, their smiles too wide, too unnatural. They looked wrong. Lily couldn't explain it. The longer she stared at the photo, the more it felt like the eyes of the students were watching her, following her every movement. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and the temperature in the room dropped. Lily spun around, panic rising in her chest. The air felt suffocating, and her breath became visible in the frigid space. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure, pale, almost translucent, standing by the chalkboard. The figure was a girl, dressed in an old-fashioned school uniform. Her face was blurred, as if it was impossible to focus on her features. She didn't move, just stood there, her presence hanging heavily in the room. Lily's legs shook as she backed away, but her feet seemed to stick to the floor as if the room itself was holding her in place. The girl's eyes, those eyes, finally became clear. They were wide and hollow, black as coal, and filled with something deep, something unfathomable. "Get out," the girl whispered, her voice soft and echoing, as though it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were barely a breath, but they cut through Lily like a knife. With everything in her, Lily pushed herself toward the door, wrenching it open. She stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. The door slammed shut behind her, and as she turned to look back, the hallway was completely empty, as if nothing had happened. But when Lily looked down at her hand, she saw something that made her blood run cold. An old-fashioned school pin, the same one the ghostly girl had worn. Lily never spoke of what happened that day. She transferred schools a few weeks later, unable to shake the image of the girl's hollow eyes. But every now and then, when she walks by a school building late at night, she catches a glimpse of something in the window, pale, silent, and watching her from the darkness. The Exorcism of Isabel Hart. Isabel Hart was a bright and vivacious 19-year-old college student from the sleepy town of Ashwood Hollow, nestled deep in the misty Appalachian Mountains. Known for her kindness and radiant smile, she was the last person anyone would expect to become the epicenter of a terrifying and unexplained phenomenon. It began subtly, restless nights and vivid, disturbing dreams. Isabel confided in her mother Eleanor about the shadowy figures she saw at the foot of her bed, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. "It's just stress," Eleanor reassured her, blaming Isabel's late-night study sessions. But the shadows didn't stay confined to her dreams. One chilly November evening, Eleanor found Isabel sitting at the dining table, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Plates were shattered around her, and her trembling hand clutched a pair of scissors. She didn't remember how she got there. Desperate for answers, the Hart family turned to Dr. Michael Graves, a local psychiatrist. His initial diagnosis was clear: dissociative identity disorder triggered by trauma. But as Isabel's episodes escalated, his medical explanations began to falter. One night, while under observation, Isabel began speaking in multiple voices simultaneously, one high-pitched and frantic, the other guttural and malevolent. Her frail body convulsed unnaturally, her fingers contorting into impossible angles. "She's ours," the voices rasped in unison, the sound reverberating through the room. One night, while under observation, Isabel began speaking in multiple voices simultaneously, one high-pitched and frantic, the other guttural and malevolent. Her frail body convulsed unnaturally, her fingers contorting into impossible angles. "She's ours," the voices rasped in unison, the sound reverberating through the room. Eleanor, a devout Catholic, reached out to Father Dominic Reyes, a skeptical yet compassionate priest. Initially hesitant, Father Reyes agreed to visit the Hart home to observe Isabel. What he witnessed shook his faith to its core. As he recited prayers, Isabel's demeanor shifted. Her once gentle eyes burned with rage. "You can't save her," she spat, her voice layered with tones no human throat could produce. The room grew icy, the air heavy with a sulfuric stench. Objects moved on their own, and the lights flickered violently. Convinced of demonic possession, Father Reyes sought permission from the church to perform an exorcism. The process was grueling and met with resistance. Officials demanded evidence and deliberated for weeks, leaving the Harts to endure Isabel's escalating torment. By the time the exorcism was approved, Isabel's condition had deteriorated. Her body bore scratches and burns that seemed to appear from nowhere. She refused to eat, her once healthy frame now skeletal. The whispers grew louder, audible to everyone in the house. The exorcism took place in the Hart family's living room, with Eleanor clutching a rosary and Dr. Graves present to monitor Isabel's health. The air crackled with tension as Father Reyes began the rite. Isabel thrashed violently, her screams echoing through the house. "We are Legion!" she bellowed, her voice a deafening roar. The walls trembled, and glass shattered. Father Reyes pressed on, sweat dripping from his brow as he commanded the entities to leave. Hours passed, and just when hope seemed lost, Isabel let out a blood-curdling scream that shook the very foundation of the house. Her body went limp, her breathing shallow. The room fell silent, save for Eleanor's quiet sobs. In the weeks following the exorcism, Isabel began to recover. She remembered little of the ordeal, her mind a blank slate. Yet the Hart family knew the house in Ashwood Hollow would never truly be free of the darkness that had taken root. Late at night, they could still hear faint whispers in the walls, and Eleanor swore she felt unseen eyes watching her as she prayed. The Hart family eventually moved away, leaving their haunted home behind. But the legend of Isabel Hart's exorcism lived on in Ashwood Hollow, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires and shared in hushed tones. The Hart's story served as a grim reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed.